Hi, so this morning I'm here with Paul Darvasi, and I first heard about Paul some time ago through an article that I received from Kathy Fuller, and I'll put the link to her article at the end of the video. And through that I heard about Paul and his work with something called the Museum of Me. But before I start asking Paul about that, I'd just like, Paul, could you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for having me today. I'm a big fan of all the great work you do in the game space, so it's a real honor to spend some time with you today. My name is Paul Darvasi. I was a classroom teacher for 20 years and experimented quite promiscuously with various game projects. I stopped teaching about a year ago now, and I lecture at the University of Toronto in their Faculty of Education, which is called OISE. I lecture on social media and education, but also games and learning and play and learning. I'm also the CEO of a company called Goldbug Interactive, and we create games for different sort of, learning experience, social justice. We work with NGOs, we've worked with the United Nations. And so my work generally exists at the intersections of learning, social justice, culture, and games.
Okay, cool. So as I mentioned before, some time ago, it's probably about 2 years ago now, I think Kathy was one of the very first contributors to Lulu Buggy magazine when it first started up. I received this article from her, and it put me onto a project that you were involved in called the Museum of Me. But I believe I'd really love to hear some more about that. So my camera's playing up a bit. But I believe there were sort of other projects that you'd been involved in before that kind of fed into the idea of the Museum of Me. So I'd really just like to hear more about that and how that all came into being.
So for about, I'd say close to 15 years now, I've had an interest in integrating commercial video games for learning, to thinking about how we can take, this vast reserve of independent and commercial, AAA games, and thinking about how we can use these very robust interactive experiences to advance learning. I did a master's sometime 2010-ish. I forget when I was working on it, and I was doing research around video games and education at the time. And I stumbled upon this article, and one of the throwaway comments of the article was, don't just think about using video games in your class, but think about turning your class into a video game. And that really struck me. I was just like, wow, what an incredible concept, like playing a video game in real life. So that sat with me for a few years. And I was teaching senior English. So these are 17 and 18-year-olds. And we were approaching the last month of school. And this would have been the last month of their career in school. This is, the last month of high school. And this is what in North America, I don't know if you have an equivalent in the UK, but in North America is what we call senioritis. And senioritis is when they've already been accepted to colleges and universities, and they only have to maintain a general sort of average within the one that they were accepted with. And so they kind of fall off the cliff. Seniors just stop. It's almost this ritual where they stop doing work and they stop showering, and they wear sweats, and that's it. Like they're done. And just as we were approaching the final month of school in senioritis, I wanted to teach, which was on the curriculum, Ken Kesey's brilliant book, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which I had never taught before. And I was really enthused by this book, and also a bit demoralized that my students would probably not read it, not be invested in it, because this was, the worst time of year to teach it. So I was up late one night. I was doing a project for OISE, actually, for the faculty where I work now. But at the time, it was something they'd reached out to teachers to work on a kind of a project, an innovation project. So I was preparing a presentation, but also very worried about what I was going to do with this novel. And I started kind of thinking, what are some creative ways that I might invest them in the story? And I started thinking they could produce artifacts and start trading them, and all these sort of different ideas. And then I had this kind of aha moment where, if you don't know the story of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, it's also a very famous film. It's actually more famous as a film than a novel, I think. It's essentially an authoritarian nurse runs an asylum in Oregon. And she basically sort of tries to normalize and really oppressively treat these patients. And then there's this rebel patient, McMurphy, who comes onto the scene and starts rebelling against the nurse and empowering the patients and allowing them to sort of express their true selves. And it's a really fascinating story. So in the midst of my worrying about teaching this novel, it occurred to me rather alarmingly that the world described in Kesey's kind of, sort of behaviorist regime of the asylum really had a lot in common with a lot of the things that I have problems with schools. That a school in the asylum, that you have, these kids are basically, they're on this uniform track. If they're not doing what they're supposed to, they're drugged or coerced. There's a series of authority figures that they're subjected to. It's almost a curriculum of normalization in the worst case scenario, where it's a very narrow script that kids have to go along. And I felt, and so that alignment between school and the asylum, and then all of a sudden that idea of turning the class into a video game all sort of converged. And I had this really bizarre vision of sitting at my desk, on my computer in school with this giant nurse's hat. and these strange things in life where, when I had that moment, it all came to me. I'm going to turn the school into an asylum. I'm going to turn this book into a game. This is what's going to, sort of enthuse my students. And what's really funny is that it worked really, really well, because the novel, without having thought about it too much, maybe on some instinctive level, the novel definitely lends itself to becoming a game. There's many kind of systems that play, and so I started.
There's a natural antagonist, isn't there? So there is that narrative tension that you need in a really good game.
Well, that's exactly it, right? Yeah. And what I did was, without any warning, I had a week to hastily plan what this might look like. And I decided I was going to turn it into this month-long event. It was loosely planned. I would come into class, and my personality, I have a little bit of an actor in me, and my personality would be very different than it normally is. I'm a very relaxed teacher normally, and I don't lose my temper very often, and I kind of roll with the punches. And all of a sudden I came in and I was angry and authoritative and demanding, and my students were like, they come in and they're half asleep on a Monday morning, and then
channeling your inner Ratchet.
Right. So then I had this kind of persona, and this is kind of the first iteration of the game. And then I started creating mission systems and playing around with the LMS and hiding things and creating treasure hunts. And all of it was inspired by events and episodes and characters and objects in the novel. I made a very sort of deliberate attempt to do this, and we ran this for a month, and it was like nothing else I have ever experienced. One, at a time when the students were meant not to be motivated, I've rarely seen them more motivated. I mean, they were all involved and intrigued and didn't know what was happening next, and creating artifacts and generating kind of these different events. I used social media. At the time when I first did it, Facebook was still something that young people used. They hadn't abandoned it yet to their grandparents and parents. And so what was really fascinating is, by creating like a Big Nurse Facebook page, a Big Nurse Twitter account, I could expand the world of the game and into and all beyond the classroom walls, because by having the social media presence, there was no limit to when the game could be played. I could post things at 10 o'clock on a Friday night, and I would get responses. This is where they're at. This is where they were, spending time and reviewing. And so And what it became once it started was this kind of wild space to experiment and to do all kinds of different things that I would normally not feel comfortable doing. And in some ways, what I did was, and this is a lot of this is accidental. I can't take too much credit for deliberately having masterminded all of this. It was kind of all through a process of trial and error, but it turned kind of senioritis to my advantage because the students hadn't really intended to work, because they were already admitted to university, because the parents didn't expect anything to be happening at that period, because my administration didn't expect anything to be happening at that period, that whatever was going on was a good thing, right? It was better than nothing. So I think it was a very opportune time to deploy something which could have been controversial or problematic at other times. And
I think that's really interesting that you say you can't take credit for having masterminded it. And I think to a certain extent we're now kind of reaching, I'm seeing a lot of the kind of discussions on LinkedIn and other places. We're kind of reaching this realization that actually we don't need to highly design everything. We don't have to be responsible for other people's learning and like creating these, you know, rigid frameworks in which people work, and actually just coming up with a really kick-ass idea like this is all that's needed, because people will respond to that.
Well, that's so funny and astute that you mentioned that, because so I ended up running the game for 4 or 5 years. The first version, the haphazard version that I'm describing now, the one where I was, you know, it was exhausting, absolutely exhausting, because, you know, I had 60 players, right, in total. They were 4 senior English classes that were all involved, and there was all this secrecy stuff as well. You weren't allowed to talk with anybody, and they were encouraged to spy on each other and report on conversations about the game. Because what this did was amazing, is that at first, of course, they're 17 and 18-year-old jaded adolescents. If you say, oh, don't talk about the game, they're like, they're going to go out, have a cigarette and talk about the game. Like, who cares, right? It's some silly school thing. But I actually, the big nurse, my alter ego, set up a series of bounties and rewards for anybody who could bring back evidence of the game being discussed outside of the kind of restricted areas where you're allowed to discuss the game. And not only were you rewarded for bringing back evidence, but students were penalized when they were discovered to have, you know, talked about it. So very quickly, there's this low level paranoia where nobody trusts anybody, and it was palpable. And what was really interesting about that is that that's the atmosphere of the novel. Like, in many ways, many of the things that occurred really reflected the institutional feel of the novel, and I could genuinely say they lived a version of it through the actual game. They were immersed in the world of the novel. So to your point about design, it was initially designed much more loosely. I didn't, you know, I was kind of making things up as I went along and trying to kind of, you know, put out fires and all of these things. But the students sensed that, and they kind of filled in a lot of those spaces. They became much more, you know, much more active in sabotaging the game and creating their own missions, and you know, so there was almost this kind of cat and mouse game between the big nurse and the students, which again reflected the narrative of the novel. As the game was more deliberately designed over the years, I felt that definitely some things were smoother, but the more you design, the less agency the players have to take that, right? And you have to find a balance, because I would say, although there were things that happened the first year that are remarkable, just the you know, there's a secret society of students that started, you know, banding together and sabotaging the game, and really just on the limit of what would be really nasty and what's actually funny and in the spirit of the game. And I'm very thankful that they kept that boundary, right? Like they found my copy of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and they kidnapped it, right? And they held it ransom. And then all of a sudden I get this, you know, and it had been gone for about a week, and I was desperately looking for it. And I get this package in the mail from a plastic surgery clinic in Arizona. And my book is inside with a series of warnings about, you know, being more careful with my stuff and all of these things. So, but as the game was designed more tightly, there was less of that element of play. However, that there was, it formalized the process and created a little bit more accountability around the learning part of it, which I think was also very important. So it's a matter of striking a balance.
Do you think, I mean, because my focus is mainly in adult learning, so do you think it would be that kind of more strict control over what goes on is necessary with younger players, or do you think that sort of like applies across the board?
I think you have to know your audience, right?
Yeah.
I think there are some high schools where it could go very badly, very badly. The whole thing about spying on each other could go very badly. The whole thing about the freedom could go very badly. I fortunately taught at a school where I knew my students really well. It was an independent school, so that kind of, there was a certain level of an expectation that I could trust would be in place. They had been sufficiently conditioned after 12 years of independent school life to behave within certain parameters. So it was a little bit risky, right? But I felt that it, in the end, the system worked. However, it's not universally applicable in the way that I did it. It doesn't, I think with adults, you could definitely do it, right? It really depends who the adults are.
They're even more conditioned.
Yeah, well, that's it. They're even more conditioned and less likely to have that kind of rebellion in them, right? To kind of, so, but, and then when I did it, when this thing was over, after, I felt like one of these castaways on the beach of an island, just, having survived something after the first month. And I felt like, wow, that was something. It felt completely different. It felt real. It felt valuable. Like I felt like, wow, the equivalent of what somebody must feel like when you've had a scientific discovery, because everything kind of clicked.
Yeah.
But I didn't really know what to do with it, right? Like I didn't know, like, do I commercialize it? Do I talk to academics? Like I was kind of lost as to what the next step was. But I came to a series of conclusions. One of them is, it's not scalable. I can't take this game that I created that was very particular to my culture, my school, my environment, my personal strengths and interests.
And that book.
And that book, like all of it. And say, okay, I'm going to create the website where teachers can pay $5.99 and run their own version of the war game. Like it wasn't that at all, right? And I think that was the first kind of conclusion. And what I thought about was, in the digital age, the time that we're living in, we're coming out of an industrial mindset of scale and uniformity, right? So you scale through, you have a good idea, you create the template, and you replicate that template for all the other teachers to do the same thing, right? That's a sense of how ideas often spread in education. But what's different about the digital age is that you can scale, but you can differentiate when you scale. So we all have apps, but we all use our apps differently, right? Yeah. There's that element of customization. So what I concluded was, the best thing to do with this is to perfect it to the best of my ability, right? And then share it. Just put it out to the world. This is what I did. These are the tools that I used. These are the things that worked. These are the things that didn't work. And then encourage educators to adapt it in a way that made sense for their unique environment. Yeah. The second thing I discovered is that I didn't know what it was that my starting point for this was a video game in real life. And I used all kinds of like email addresses, social media. I tried to, one of my tricks was, whenever I felt like I needed to spice things up or I needed a new mechanic, I would look at lists of game mechanics that are available online and see which ones corresponded with features of the story, and that would create a new element for the game. And I did that a lot. And over several years, that really kind of expanded. And so what the experience most resembled in the end, what's known as an alternate reality game, an ARG. And if you look up alternate reality games, you'll see what they're all about. They're kind of an adult version of what I'm describing. And they're these kind of immersive experiences that blur the lines between reality and fiction. And that's something I really strove for, is creating a sense that they had to sign documents, that, you know, that it was a very invasive experience. I wanted them to create as much of an immersive environment for my students as possible. So then when I realized that it had an ARG element, that helped me guide my design a little further, borrowing from the ARG, or alternate reality game playbook. And I learned a lot about that in the process. And I think that the most important mechanic that you know surged from this was that students didn't have to do anything in this game. You could just sit back and do nothing if you wanted. However, you were asked, you were trying to earn points. If you got to 100 points, you were released from the asylum. That means if a student got to 100 points 2 weeks into the game, they didn't have to show up in class anymore. They could go off into this, you know, grab a coffee during English class and check in with me. So there was this incentive to get out. But the point system was such, and I devised this after some tweaking, where the further up you go the scale, the harder it becomes to earn points, right? And the narrative connection is that the longer that the patients are in the asylum, instead of getting better, they actually get worse. Their condition tends to worsen.
Institutionalized.
That's right, exactly. And so it was implied that the longer they were in the game, the mental health struggles that were being aggravated made it harder for them to function, which is exactly what happens in the novel, and therefore harder to earn the points and complete the missions. So one of the key ways, there were many, many ways to earn points, but one of the main ways to earn points was through what I ended up calling the prescription system. And I tried to keep it kind of clinical, right? So the prescription system was, by the time it evolved, I started with a really dumb deployment of it, where basically I would send out different missions and you could accept them or reject them. And imagine having 60 players and my trying to keep up with that. It was insane. And then instead, I had my aha moment for the second design, where players can request a prescription at any time. They write the big nurse and they say, "Big nurse, I want a prescription." And they're told in advance, in their kind of intake into the asylum, they're told that the prescriptions can be in any one of approximately a dozen categories. So these could be law, music, engineering, creative writing, any number of music, all kinds of different categories. So they could say, "I want a prescription in law." So the big nurse sends them this colorful email with a picture and a description and a little rubric. And it says, you know, this mission is worth this many points. There was an economy in the game as well. It was actually cigarettes, oddly enough. So you could get these many cigarettes for it and this bonus card. You have 72 hours to complete it, right? It was all on hours. It wasn't weeks or days, it was hours. And, you know, so for example, it could be in the novel, and they're all connected to the novel. All the prescriptions are connected to the novel. So there's an indigenous character in the novel whose people were, you know, the government came in and put a power dam and blocked their traditional fishing site. And this caused a lot of problems for his people and created kind of tension between this indigenous group and the government. So one of the law prescriptions is to research situations where dams have been built in Canada and on indigenous land, and what the legal repercussions of that were. You know, that would be one example. When they request a prescription, they can accept it or reject it. So they could say, I don't like this law prescription, send me another law prescription. Or I don't like any of the law prescriptions, send me a music prescription. And then boom, they get the music prescription they want, they accept it, the clock starts, and they have 72 hours to finish whatever the task is in that time. And what's really interesting is I thought for sure they're going to troll the game. Some guy is going to start saying no, 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 no to every prescription to see the end of it. Like, how many prescriptions does this guy have in his back pocket before we just tank it? But what was really fascinating in the 4 years that I ran it, that never happened because, and I suspect—
I might have done that.
What's that? You might have done that? Right. But here's the thing that I realized is they genuinely were interested in doing the prescription because it played to their passions. Like if you love music and you get a really cool music task, like create a song about the main character, or put a playlist together that focuses on mental illness or whatever the case may be, you want to do it and you don't want to lose it, right? Like you don't want to reject it and then not come back to it. And I realized that because it really is remarkable that in 4 years, approximately 50 to 60 adolescent boys playing. I teach at an all boys school. It was all boys playing every year, and nobody ever did that, right? That really speaks to the fact that this system worked. And then the other thing, which was remarkable, is that it wasn't one of these things that they would send the product of the mission, like they had to create, I don't know, the floor plan of the asylum or whatever it was that they were doing, that the rubric was only for the highest standards. And that meant it was all absolutes. You either sent a good version of the product that was required, or it's sent back to you to fix it and send it, and then you get total points. It wasn't like, oh, you get a B plus and 75% of the points allotted. No, it's either all or nothing. And again, what was fascinating is that in the 4 years, I think once I had to send something back, because they were doing things that they cared about. They were old enough to know how to maintain a certain standard, which they, the 12 years of schooling had taught them that. And because it was on this hourly kind of 72, 96, 24, 48 hour thing, they were producing more work in that month-long period on their own time than ever, right? And what this taught me, that the experiment of doing this was, when you give students choice, when you connect the learning to their passions, I mean, these are the things that we know as being games people, it increases engagement, it increases motivation, it gets better work from them. And what I learned through the game, I started using in my classes that were even not game, giving them more options, allowing them more flexibility in terms of getting work in. And in some ways, it really taught me to be a better teacher.
It's that I've been doing a lot of thinking and writing about the magic circle recently, and it's that really important thing about games-based learning or play-based learning, is that play is voluntary. And if you just go, right, here's a game and it's going to be really fun, but you have to do it because this is the course that your boss is sending you on, it's not games-based learning, because it's just using a play-based delivery system.
Right.
But it's still the same old thing. It's not games-based learning because it has to be voluntary. You can't make people play. So what you're talking about there is you keep giving them the options until the option that they want comes up, and then they voluntarily enter the magic circle and they will give it their best.
Well, that's it. And the greater circle, right? Because that's the inner circle of the prescription system. The greater circle is the game itself. And it's such an astute point you make, because the first year, I didn't make it voluntary participation. Everybody had to play. And I'll be honest, there were moments in that first year where it started getting into the territory of like social experiment, where there were some very disturbed students about my change in behavior. Some rather, I remember there was a pretty dangerous mission in the early parts of the game where the first day of the game, anybody because one problem when you teach English is half the kids don't bring the novel to class, right? So they're sharing, or you have to find online PDFs. It's always this kind of haphazard thing, right? So the first thing is, there were those who had the novel who were asked to sit in one part of the class, and those who didn't, that were asked to sit in another part of the class. And they had 2 hours, I think, or 75 minutes to organize a method to get the novel, right? And that included going to a local bookstore. However, they had to devise a system that we in class could track the movements of the person going to the bookstore to buy the book. And there was this kind of semi-dangerous situation where some kid is racing down the main street of our school in his car, returning from the bookstore while so it was like, it was like all the walls were blown up and things were happening. And then I realized after that, I can't do this again. Like I can't, that's not safe. It could lead to really, I dodged a few bullets on that first iteration. I was just kind of lost in the moment and doing all, pushing boundaries in every direction and really breaking school, right? Breaking what rules and safety precautions. Like it was a mad period. So what I decided for all subsequent versions of the game in the years that followed is the students, once the game started, once we, it was always a surprise. I never told them we were going to play a game. It always kind of came out of nowhere. But then they had, after the first class, the option not to play and the option to do something else. And it wasn't one of those things like either play the game or write an essay where the alternative is not attractive, right? So I'm kind of railroading them into playing the game. So what I did is I worked with students who didn't feel comfortable playing the game and devised a study plan that would run parallel to the game, where they would use the class period to go to the library and work on a project that meant something to them as an alternative. So every year I would have 2 or 3 students who opted out of the game. And they were typically students who were very concerned about their grades and didn't want to lose control. Like they just didn't know what they were going into, and they just wanted to be safe and in control of what was going on. So to your point, I did create levels of voluntary kind of participation. And the other thing is, no matter how far in the game you were in or how far along you were, you always had the option to bail out. You could always approach me and say, I don't want to play anymore. Whatever points that equal grades that you've earned so far will keep, and then we'll think of something else to make up for the rest that you can do otherwise.
Because I think that's really important, because I think it's without that voluntary aspect, you just reduce games to another way of delivering something. So it's equivalent to having a lecture or being given a handout. But once you actually sort of like meet games where they are, which is about entering the magic circle, which has to be voluntary, if you go back to Huizinga and people like that, it elevates it, and you actually start to realize, no, this isn't just about another method of delivery. This is about the way that people learn. This is about how your brain actually works and how people engage with sensing and making sense of the world. And but without, it's just that simple thing of going, you have to do it. And it just reduces it to just another method of delivery, I think.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And what it makes me, sort of think about, and I have thought about this quite a bit, is that the options for students and the way that they learn, it shouldn't just be within the scheme. So I've created a game and there's options within the game. The scheme itself should be an option, right?
Yes.
Like you should have students in an ideal, perfect educational world should not only have some choice in terms of how they choose to learn, but also this, like, for example, I'm not a strong exam writer, so I should have a slide that says the exam for me will only be worth 10%, but my assignments will be worth 30% because I'm stronger on assignments. So give them, but also balancing, because what collapses at the other end of the scale, if you give young people absolute and 100% choice to do whatever they want, they're going to play to their strengths and to what they think they like. And part of our obligation as educators is to expose them to things that they may think they're not going to like, or that they may think they're not good at, but that they are. So I think that the magic in all of this is balancing choice and agency with a little bit of pushing them into directions safely and not punitively, so that by taking a risk that doesn't endanger your grade or your success in the class. So creating incentives for students to go outside of their comfort zone as well as in their comfort zone, and balancing all of that, I think is pretty ideal.
Yeah. So sort of digress slightly there. We've been talking for quite a while. So I did want to get on to the Museum of Me. So that kind of grew out of the work you've been doing with the One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest project. So yes, tell me more about the Museum of Me and what's involved in that.
when I revisit, sort of, I look back at my experiments with games, and I created other similar alternate reality games inspired by what is known as the Ward game. That was the name of the game. That it was, the first year was just known as the game. It had no title. In its rough draft, everybody just called it the game, and then it became the Ward game as it became more formalized. So those kinds of experiments, I think of, you think of center and circumference, right? So those are circumference experiments where you're actually changing the structure and function of school to become more game-like or more dynamic or whatever the case may be. Then the other side of experiments with games are games as center. So using a board game in your class to teach about photosynthesis, or using a video game in your class to look at Roman history, where the structure of the class doesn't change. It operates pretty much classroom as usual, but you're using a game to substitute, a text, for example, or as a learning artifact. So while doing all this, word game business, I was also starting about the same time to experiment using video games in literature classes. And so the first video game that I did a lot of work with is a narrative, kind of disrespectfully called a first-person walker, or a walking simulator called Gone Home, which is a beautiful 3-hour video game about a young girl who returns to a new family home that she's not familiar with. Her family's not there when she returns after her kind of backpacking trip, Eurorailing trip in Europe. And she explores the house over the course of 3 hours. And by reading letters and uncovering materials, a story emerges about what happened to her family while she was away. Very rich character development, really deep storytelling. And then I thought, this is worthy of an English class. I mean, this has all the richness, all the narrative richness that we could find in a short story, a play, or a novel, but it's in this interactive form. And because this is a form that's relevant to this generation, that stories are increasingly being told in interactive ways, that it's important that they study how interactivity affects narrative, how you think about narrative and storytelling differently in these kind of immersive, virtual, interactive environments. And I think we have to do more of that, right? We're moving away from the novel, right? We're moving away from, unfortunately or fortunately, there's always a little bit of grief when we have these kind of cultural transitions. So that started a series of experiments of using video games, in my classes, but then I started working with other teachers to implement a variety of video games. While doing this work and writing about it and sharing it, I was always a big fan of sharing my work freely to inspire anybody who would be interested. I started having conversations with an amazing organization in the States called the I Thrive Games Foundation. I think it's just I Thrive Games now. And they were doing work where they wanted to support teens through video games for social and emotional development and social and emotional learning, which I thought was very forward thinking. And they'd seen the work that I'd done with teens, with video games that did have some crossover, and we started talking, and I'd worked with them on some other projects. And eventually they thought, well, let's put together a curriculum that sort of, that really uses all of the techniques that we can to support social and emotional development with teens using a particular video game. So we ended up choosing What Remains of Edith Finch, a very rich narrative game similar to Gone Home. And we decided that the problem with social and emotional learning in schools is school curriculums are jam-packed as they are, right? Most teachers are rushing to meet their curricular objectives. Schools have very packed schedules. There's very little wiggle room to add more. So to create a space for social and emotional learning is very difficult in most schools unless there's a very deliberate strategy to do this. So one of the things that we talked about with iThrive is it makes more sense to create curriculum for existing classes that meets the objectives of the existing class, but also advances the agenda of social and emotional learning. And English is a good class to do that in, because you are addressing the human condition, you are addressing emotions and motivations and all these types of things. So we built a unit, a curricular unit around What Remains of Edith Finch, where we analyzed it much as we would a short story or a novel, but very much focused on issues of identity. And we looked at how we use the game as a way for students to reflect on their own identities and the variability of their identities and how identities can change over time. And that's part of building resilience in terms of understanding yourself. And particularly, we used a lot of social media stuff because there's a real crossover with social media and identity, how you present yourself publicly versus what's going on privately, right? We all show our best versions of ourselves on social media, but that's by no means an accurate reflection of the iceberg that exists underneath, right? Of our, I certainly don't take a picture of myself when I wake up in the morning and post it on Facebook. My brother does, though, oddly enough. My brother does that. He's very honest about his presentation of himself to the world. So and that's a really important and underserved topic because social media has a huge impact on young people, and often they don't have the tools to deal with some of the more negative aspects of it. And it's not all negative. There's some very positive aspects of using social media. So all of this was bundled together in a curricular unit called the Museum of Me. And the reason it was called the Museum of Me is that in Edith Finch, there's a museum-like quality to the house where they all live, where you're visiting kind of the almost a mausoleum-like sort of bedrooms of all these deceased relatives, and you're finding out about their stories. So rather morbidly or similarly, one of the things that the students could do at the end is create a museum of their own lives and identities to explore themselves and who they are and how they've evolved. And share this on websites and through Twine and other ways, other platforms. And again, there was choice built into it. So I worked with Dr. Matthew Farber. We co-designed it. I worked with the I Thrive Games Foundation. They brought in experts on social and emotional learning. They brought in experts on UDL, which is Universal Design for Learning, which is a way to create greater accessibility in curriculum. So creating multimodal experiences or choices and to respond to the material to kind of cater to a wide berth of students. So lots of support, lots of collaboration. And we put together this unit that is now absolutely free for anybody who wants to use it. It's beautifully published on the I Thrive Games Foundation site. And I think it really, I've run the unit a number of times. We've run it in, anywhere from high-end independent schools to what in the United States is called a Title I school, which usually has an underserved population of students. And it has been very successful in all of its deployments. And it's been really meaningful, and the kids have really enjoyed it. And I think it really emblemizes a very sort of good use of a commercial video game in an instructional environment.
Excellent. Well, it's been really, really interesting talking about this. I know we've talked about it before, but I've learned so many new things today from our additional conversation. Is there anything that you would, any places that you want to point people towards, any takeaways that you'd like to leave listeners with?
One thing that's really important, what I really, the word game, I think when my eyes shut in my final moments and I look back at all the things I've done in my life, I think the word game is something that I will be very proud of. And the reason is that aside from it being a really unique kind of experiment, what I think symbolically it does is, on the surface of the game, this authoritarian nurse, the kind of disciplinary element, it satirically overemphasizes all the worst parts of traditional kind of factory education, right? But simultaneously and rather paradoxically, when you look under the hood, it also is forward facing by creating systems which I think and hope will start characterizing the new phase of education in the digital age. So it's this kind of Janus face project, and it's almost like what I was saying earlier about it not being scalable. I almost see it weirdly as this collaborative installation piece, like almost an art project that I'm collaborating with the dead but still present Ken Kesey, and who I think, you know, I channeled a lot of his ideas. I give him ultimate credit for all of it. And then my students all like, it was a really collaborative experience. So all of this to say, in answer to your question, that I wrote extensively about it in a book that is available completely for free called Teacher Pioneers. And if you look it up, Teacher Pioneers, it is available through, I'm going to forget the name of the press. It's out of Carnegie Mellon. It's a press that publishes a lot of great game stuff. I think it's like EDC Press or, and
I
so.
shall look it up and add it to a card at the end of the video.
Excellent. Okay. I feel embarrassed that I don't remember the name of it because I read their stuff all the time.
We all get that.
Yeah, it's happening more and more, oddly enough. And so in that book, aside from the chapter that I have on the ward game, I also have a chapter on using Gone Home in the classroom, but there's lots of other chapters by people who are doing amazing things. So the book is completely free. It's PDF. You can download it. I think you can donate if you want, but I don't think Carnegie Mellon necessarily needs more money. And then so there's that. My website, which is my blog, my personal blog, which I have not added to since 2016, which is oddly enough when I started my doctorate. So I think there's a correlation between the two. That blog has a substantial amount of information about incorporating video games in the classroom, but also about the early stages of creating the ward game. So they could go there, and, you know, feel free to follow me on Twitter at Paul Darvasi, or on LinkedIn, which is just my name, Paul Darvasi. And I'm always looking to expand my network of people that are interested in all this stuff. So it'd be nice to connect with anybody who's interested.
Excellent. Well, thank you very, very much for your time. As I said, it's been really, really interesting, and I'm sure the readers of Ludagogy will find this absolutely fascinating. And yes, so thank you very much, and I'll let you get back to your day.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Sarah. It's such an honor and a pleasure to chat with you, and I know that we're like-minded, and I admire your work so much, and it's a real honor to be included in it.
Making me blush. I'll speak to you soon. Thank you.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.